Hello guys and welcome back. 1.0 is here and we're on day 4. We're actually doing a streamathon right now over on Twitch and also our more total YouTube channel. But I thought we would jump into the game and quickly do a video covering the alternative recipes. More importantly, the early alternative recipes available in 1.0 and which are the best to use and which you may be not so interested in. Now I can see chat sending messages. I will try to ignore them for this, but the video is going to be slightly different to usual in that because it's also during a live stream. It's going to be less edited down. You're going to see my face and we're going to talk through everything. If you like this and you want me to do this for the next tier of alternative recipes, then please do let me know, but let's get into it. And I should also mention actually, before we do, alternative recipes in the game are very subjective. It depends on where you are in the game and what kind of factory you have running. And so this is geared to the early game. I've seen some lists online which have totally different beliefs as to what's a good recipe. And there are some incredible recipes in 1.0 that we've seen so far in the early game, and we're going to get into them. You want to use these in pretty much any of your factories, but be aware that it is subjective and what might work for me might not work for you. So please let me know in the comments below which you think is the best for yourself. But before we do that, I need to very quickly jump into my save and talk a little bit about how the hard drives work in 1.0. So as we get into 1.0, we have the MAM. We're now able, ooh, we just got a hard drive unlocked. Perfect timing. We're able to go through our hard drive library after we've scanned a hard drive, and they will be listed here. I think you can only fill the library up till the box is full. I don't think you can scroll through them, so do be aware of that. But for most people, I highly recommend, rather than just picking the best recipe that you see out of the two that you've got, storing them. And the reason for this is there is a selection of recipes that are available to us in 1.0. And every time you scan a hard drive, you will have these two recipes taken away from the pool of recipes available. So by holding on to a hard drive and these two recipes, you lessen the pool and increase the likelihood of you receiving a better recipe if you have some bad ones. So as you can see here, I think I've unlocked cast screws. That's the only one I've currently unlocked in the game. Though we have bolted iron plates here, iron wire, we've got the iron pipe, the bolted frame. We've got some of the really good recipes that are available in the early game that we're not unlocking because we're not needing to use them just yet in our starter factory. And by holding on to them, we're increasing the chances of getting better recipes, because as soon as we pick steel rotor here or copper alloy ingot, the other recipe is going to go back into the pool and we will have to go and roll the dice and try and find them again. So it's better to do it this way. And of course, if you find a recipe or two recipes and you're not bothered about them, you can rescan the hard drive as well. It will hold just two different recipes in. But with that out of the way, let's jump into the game. And I should also mention, I'm going to refer to early game, possibly early mid-game in this. If I'm saying early game, I am assuming that you have a very bare bones setup, that you've got just the very base recipes being produced and probably not much power. You probably haven't hit coal power yet. If I'm saying early mid-game, you're entering the coal phase where you can start automating items. And if I'm talking about mid-game, it's where you're going to be using these particular recipes in larger scale factories, and they're going to be really useful for that, or maybe aren't. So with that out of the way, we're going to go over to our creative mode, our advanced game settings, and we're going to look at the recipes that are currently available up until tier, wait, what tier are we at? I should have checked this out. We've just sent off the first space elevator tier. So we've got 0, 1 through to 4 in terms of our alternative recipes. And I should also mention some of the alternative recipes are unlocked through research, so you will have to go through your quartz or your Caterium to unlock some of these, such as like fused Quickwire. Anyway, let's head over there. So here we are at our testbed. Now we have the foundry, the constructor, and the assembler for our starting recipes. And the first recipe that we're going to be looking at is just your basic iron recipes. We have iron alloy ingot, and I think the other one's basic iron ingot. Out of the two, this one, the iron alloy ingot, has to be the worst because it is taking copper, which is a rarer resource. It's harder to find in the early game, and you're not producing as much because they tend to be impure or normal nodes that you find of copper. And you're using that with iron ore, which is much more commonly found around the map, similarly to limestone. And as such, you may be getting an increase in iron production, but you are using up copper that could be used elsewhere. If you do have a lot of copper around, then this could be quite a good call for you, but apart from that, I wouldn't recommend it. We then have the basic iron ingot. Basic iron ingot is a really good one if you have plenty of limestone freely available. If you're producing more concrete than you need, you can put some limestone into a foundry with the iron to produce a good amount of iron ingots, producing double the amount of iron ingots to the iron ore that you have in exchange for the 40 per minute of limestone. So this is a pretty good recipe. Moving on, we're going to look at the steel ingots next. So we have the classic steel ingot. This is 4545. Then we have the solid steel ingot, and this hasn't changed from pre 1.0. This is a fantastic recipe to have. You're going to have an extra step in your production line to produce the iron ingots and then feed them into here. But you're getting 20 extra steel at the cost of 20 less coal and 20 less iron. So this is a really good one to get. Highly recommend doing it using the 2/3 of coal and iron for steel. Good recipe. We then have the copper alloy ingot. So the basic copper recipe is 30 copper ore to 30 ingots, if I remember rightly. I think it's 1-to-1. This takes your 50 copper and combines it with 50 iron. Important to remember, iron is more commonly and easily available in the early game, and it turns it to 100 copper ingots per minute. So this is a really good recipe for pretty much any case, because there's always going to be iron available. So definitely good to go with that. Moving on, we have the steamed copper sheet recipe. This is only available to actually use once you have refineries available. And the problem with that is we do not have refineries in the first 4 tiers. So if you get this, definitely hold on to it. It's great once you get it. You're just combining water with copper to get those steamed copper sheets. But until then, it's not worth taking. Same with your wet concrete. So wet concrete here, you can see this is available. This uses water and combines it with limestone to create concrete. It is fantastic in the late game. It's often used to manage byproducts of water. You just combine it with limestone, and then you have concrete that you can sink in the awesome sink. So this is a really good recipe, but it's not available at the moment, even though we have it available in our tiers. So hold on to that so that you're lessening the pool of hard drive rerolls. There's also fine concrete. Looking at this really quickly, wouldn't recommend it. You're using quartz, which is a rarer resource. It's harder to find in the early game, and combining that to make a lot more concrete, but it's not worth it. Okay, moving on, we have got the alternate steel cast plate. This is combining steel, coal and iron in order to produce more iron plates. My argument against this is that in the early game or early mid game, you're wanting to get up your steel production, you're wanting to get up your power production. And so that coal is going to be better used elsewhere than on iron plates where you already have lots of iron available. Similar to the coated iron plates, we have these steel rods. Again, it produces a lot of rods from the steel, but it's using up that coal, so in the early to mid game, it's not worth it. Early to mid game, it's just not worth it. Now, wire is an interesting one. We have quite a few wire recipes. There is the iron wire. This is one of the best recipes, despite so many people saying it's not a good recipe. With iron being so freely available everywhere, this means that if you have a factory location that is away from copper, you can use iron instead, and you don't have to use caterium, which is another recipe that we'll get to shortly. Also, with it being iron, you can take out copper from any of those wired recipes, and with it being a rarer resource, that means we can move on to some really cool recipes and turn them into iron only that have only just been made available in 1.0. We then have the alternate caterium wire. Now, if you have a lot of caterium in your factory or around your factory and you're not using it, then yes, I'd definitely consider using this, but it's a limited use case. You're probably going to want to be using the caterium elsewhere for something like Quickwire. The only other thing that I can possibly pull out from this recipe is that because it's producing so much per minute, you'll be using less constructors for your wire lines, which is going to reduce the amount of energy needed in the early game, which obviously energy is quite restricted in the early game. So you may want to do it for that reason. But it is a good recipe. It's just limited uses. And then we have fused wire. Now this one has good throughput of resources. The only thing is that we are again using caterium, which is a rare resource, and if you had the copper around, I'd recommend going with that over caterium. That being said, if you haven't got that much copper around and you have got a bit of caterium, then this can be a great way to increase your wire production for later on. So it's a good recipe, just varied use cases. All right, what are we moving on to next? We have screws. I hate screws. To be fair, the 2 screw recipes that we have are very good. So this is the only recipe that I have unlocked immediately in my Let's Play. This is the cast screw, and what it does is it cuts out the iron rod production chain in the build. This is really good because it reduces the power usage by 4 megawatts per constructor. That is a considerable amount of energy in the early game when you're relying on biomass generators. So for that, I would definitely go with this if you find it immediately. If you find it while you're still trying to reach coal and you're working through your early phase. Otherwise, I would hold out for alternative steel screws. Steel screws do use coal in exchange for screws. That is a slight drawback, but given the throughput, the amount of screws that it's producing, and how we can transport just a few steel beams to a constructor in order to get that output, I would class this as one of the best recipes that there are available in the game. And we do have a new steel beam recipe that combines, if I remember rightly, we'll cover it in a moment, concrete. If we concrete with steel ingots in order to produce more steel beams, that could be used with this to further increase its efficacy. Right, moving on from screws, we have the rotor recipes. We have the copper rotor, which is this one here. This one is good for scaling early game rotors because of its high throughput of rotors. However, you are requiring a lot of screws per minute, and you'll have to have tier 3 belts in order to keep up with that. And so it's a bit of a drawback for this if you were to use it. However, there is a far superior recipe, and that is the steel rotor. And I've used this a lot in my current Let's Play, my previous Let's Play series, where you take steel pipes and combine it with wire to produce your rotors. However, we can make this an iron-only rotor, which we'll get onto shortly if we combine the iron wire with the iron pipes recipe. And that elevates this alternative recipe to S tier in my mind, and can allow us to produce iron only motors in 1.0. This is a huge change and well worth taking when you're at the stage of building your motor or rotor factory. Moving on from the steel rotor, we'll move on to steel now. And so we have a new steel beam recipe, and that's the alternate molded beam. This is another really good recipe. Once you're past the early game and you're into the early mid game and you start being able to produce a lot more resources, you've got your Mark II miners, you're able to produce a lot more concrete. And if you have that concrete available, you're able to produce the steel beams at a higher efficiency by combining the concrete with steel ingots. So do recommend doing this. It's a third the more steel beams at the cost of just 80 concrete overall. So really good going into early mid game onwards. We'll need to check. If you'd like me to follow this up with a mid-tier, tier 5 and 6 alternate recipes review, then let me know and perhaps we'll go through it and we'll see that there's a better recipe or maybe not of this. But yeah, this is a really good one going into the early mid game. Speaking of the steel rotor earlier on, we have some new pipe recipes. Similarly to the steel beam that we just saw, we have the molded steel pipe, which uses concrete with steel in order to produce the steel pipes. So this recipe is good if you're entering the mid game, but you have to bear in mind that it is going to be a little bit more power intensive because you do need to produce those steel ingots in your foundry first, as well as the concrete. But on the whole, it's a pretty good recipe. However, we then have the alternative iron pipe. This is an incredible recipe. I can't sing its praise enough. Yes, we're taking a lot of iron in order to produce like a quarter the amount of steel pipes, but we're taking the most common resource in the game in order to produce something that is slightly more difficult to produce with coal and steel. So this is a great recipe, but also this changes later game recipes that are dependent on your steel pipes. So we're going to look at encased industrial beams in a little bit. This can affect that and make it an iron only recipe. And of course, we've already talked about how your steel rotors and your base stator recipe can make iron only motors as well. So really good recipe to get. And if you're going to start producing steel pipes in larger factories, I highly recommend using this. Okay, so we now have our reinforced iron plates, and the first recipe, this isn't the first recipe, that's the base recipe. The first recipe is the bolted iron plates. Now this is fast production, which is great for early mid-game factories, but there is one caveat to this, and this is the amount of screws per minute. So you need 250 screws per minute, which means obviously you have to have tier 3 belts available, or you're going to be hand feeding everything. And the only way I'd make this viable in my factory is if I'm using the steel screw alternate recipe, because that is a lot of screws needed per assembler. And it really means that you're not able to do manifolds easily unless you have constructed directly behind. You're not going to be able to transport that amount of screws en masse. But we do have the alternate stitched iron plate. And this allows you, thanks to the lower amount of resources needed on a belt, you can see 37.5 wire per minute, 18.75 iron per minute, to build manifolds of this, which will allow you to produce more reinforced iron plates per minute. So the other thing I should mention is that this one is less power intensive So if you're worried about power, then you can consider this one. However, this one, with it having wire, we can partner that with the iron wire, as we mentioned earlier, to produce a iron only version of the reinforced plates with the wire. Obviously the other ones are iron only. But because of that, I'd recommend using this just because there's a higher throughput and you're able to get more out. Moving on, we have the modular frames. We have the alternate bolted frame. This again uses a lot of screws per minute, which is a slight issue, but it can be partnered again with the steel screw alternate recipe, allowing you to produce consistent early game modular frames. And then we have our alternative steeled frame. So this is going to be really good for larger factories, as it uses less machines overall and thus less space. It's also using the steel pipes. We can turn that into iron should we wish, removing the coal to make it more viable for you. So I would argue that it's good for medium, like mid-game factories where you're starting to scale up your production. Moving on, we have alternate for encased industrial beams. This is a fantastic recipe. Highly recommend using it just in general because it reduces the amount of resources required to build by about 25%, if I remember rightly, for your coal and your iron. However, if we partner it with the iron pipe, once again, we can make this an iron only recipe. So fantastic recipe for that. Highly recommend going with it once you're at the point of building your encased industrial beams. It will require a bit more power. But that's the only downside to this one. From this point onwards, what do we have left? We have the Quickwire, so let's quickly go over that one. I don't think we have any in here. Any of the recipes. Oh, wait. Let's talk about this really quickly. Alternate fused quartz crystal. So with this one, you are using coal in order to produce more quartz. I don't think it's a bad recipe. However, with you wanting to use coal for steel or power production in the early mid game, I wouldn't recommend using it, at least just yet. I haven't run the numbers in terms of how it works out, but that's my gut feeling with this. So cheap silica, this one, similarly to the one that we just saw, replaces raw quartz with, or reduces the amount of raw quartz needed and combines it with something else to produce more. Cheap silica happens to use limestone, which is much more freely and commonly available. And so this is a great recipe if you're wanting to set up a dedicated silica line. Highly recommend it at the cost of a bit more power. So definitely early to mid game. We then have our Quickwire, and that is the fused Quickwire. This combines Caterium, the rarer resource, with copper, and quite a bit of copper, to produce Quickwire. This is a great recipe. If you're further in the game and you're needing a lot of Quickwire for whatever reason, whether it's for producing AI limiters or something else, then this is going to be your go-to recipe over just the base Quickwire recipe, because it's combining a more common resource with Caterium to get your Quickwire. I think that's everything. So to take away, don't just pick recipes at random. Don't just pick recipes because they're good anymore. Hold on to them until you absolutely need them to reduce the amount of recipes in the pool so that you can find better recipes earlier on. There is a limit to how many recipes that you can have. We were just talking in chat about it. However, once you research more recipes than you can scroll down on the hard drive, you'll still be able to research them, you just won't be able to see them. So it's not going to lessen your ability to find good recipes. You're just going to have to start clicking through your favorite ones if you want to see what's down there and accepting a couple of recipes. But on the whole, the new recipes in the early game are fantastic. Highly recommend going out and exploring and getting some hard drives for your playthrough series. and experimenting. But guys, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know if you'd like a follow-up of this. This is just me thinking off the top of my head, looking at these recipes with a few notes to refer to. If you'd like me to do a tier list specifically, like we've done previously, then again, let me know and perhaps we'll do that. But we're going to leave it there. But guys, thank you so much for watching, and thank you as always to all of our amazing supporters on Patreon, most notably our Lunas, Fireflest, The Calamity, Ben and Star, and our Blood Moon of the day, which today is Shlom. Until next time, as always, ciao for now.